afternoon. On behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, welcome to our discussion this afternoon of semiconductors and the importance of semiconductors in geotechnology and our competition with some of our global rivals, specifically focusing on the competition with China and a discussion with the authors of the new white paper, The Race for Semiconductors Supremacy, China versus an Emerging Democratic Technology Alliance. We're pleased to have the authors of the paper here, Andy Keiser and Michael Lumpkin, for a conversation about what is a hot topic in national security circles, but also all those who are focusing on supply chain issues. If you're looking at auto manufacturing or other electronics, semiconductors play a major role, particularly as we move into a highly connected world, as 5G technologies begin to increasingly dominate the way we communicate, both between people and devices, and devices. Semiconductors are a vital part of those links. And when there are shortages or questions about the safety of the supply chain, they become critical questions for many areas of our economy. We're proud to have Andy Keiser, who has been a long-time senior fellow at CSPC and is a principal at Navigators Global. And Andy also was one of the leading voices for national security on Capitol Hill for many years, supporting as chief of staff and key advisor on intelligence and cybersecurity and other issues, Chairman Mike Rogers, who is the David Absher Chair at CSPC. Of course, it is always an important element of our work to operate in a very bipartisan fashion at CSPC. And Mike and I work very closely together in partnership on all of our national security questions. We identified the great powers competition, and specifically competition for advanced technologies with rivals like China, as a key area of our national security focus. And we have been studying various elements of that over several years, including policy moves made under the prior presidential administration and in Congress, and by the current presidential administration on issues related to geotechnology, and specifically semiconductor safety, security, and supply. Most notably, lately there has been a momentum move to really leverage our relationships with allied democracies in this competition with China. And that's something that Andy and Michael are going to speak to today as they introduce and talk about their report. I'll hand it off in a moment to Dan Mahathi to lead that conversation and then invite questions from the audience. But I did want to recognize also Michael Lumpkin's background. He brings quite an amazing set of career experiences to his focus on semiconductors and on national security issues. Someone who has served as a Navy SEAL, spent significant time in private business, and also served in senior roles at the State Department, Veterans Affairs, and as an acting Under Secretary of Defense for Policy. So we're very pleased to have Michael's involvement in this report with Andy. Looking forward to the conversation today. Very important topic. Let me invite Dan Mahathi to kick us off and get us right into the conversation on the report. Dan.
Thanks, Glenn, and thanks to Michael and Andy too. Great report. I certainly want to thank you for the work you've done. And before I get to the questions, give you an opportunity to share a few initial thoughts on your findings, what you discovered, what trends you've seen since last year, and what policymakers and industry leaders should be thinking about on this topic.
Yeah, I can go ahead and kick us off, Dan, and then hand it over to Michael for his observations and thoughts, and to tell me what I screwed up, which I'm sure will be voluminous. Well, thanks so much to Congressman Nye and my old boss, Congressman Mike Rogers. I think their leadership on these issues at the center over these last 5 years or so has been exemplary. And for folks who are new to the center or to the center's work, I highly encourage you to check out everything from national security space work that is being done at the center to these geotechnology issues where we take a look at China using technology in a similar way that the Russians use energy, which is to cajole, bully, and often use that leverage to their own advantage with their neighbors and globally. So thanks for having me and Dan and Michael and for publishing the report. Yeah, so I think Glenn set the table great. It's a highly timely topic. I think today at the White House, there's a meeting being convened on the general supply chain issue. This one in particular more to do with the jam at the ports. But last week focused on supply chain of semiconductors specifically. Also last week we had the Senate confirmation of the potential Bureau of Industry Security at Commerce, the director Alan Estevez and Tia Kendler, his deputy, who will be looking at export controls. They were both confirmed by the Senate Banking Committee last week, which of course ends up being an incredibly important department in the government for executing on these very high priority national security challenges. And Michael's going to get into some of that, where we always think of the DoD or the State Department or the National Security Council. Well, in fact, a lot of times in these technology issues, the more important players are out at Commerce or at the Treasury Department. So we want to make sure to keep sight on those. And then, of course, we're in a situation, I'm from Michigan, we make cars in Michigan, and we have the idling of some 20 auto plants around the world due to shortage of chips, something that is really unthinkable, is costing them billions of dollars. And it just gives us a sense for the importance of this very small but very key component to everything from the phone in our pocket to the most complex weapon system that Michael and his cohorts know all too well, certainly more than me. So we begin to think about chips and semiconductors, I'll use that term interchangeably, as a national security commodity, one that is very important to protect, one that is very important to maintain supply lines to have access to. And we saw, I think with COVID, the response of having to rely on an adversary for critical supply chains, like in medical supplies, is not a great place to be for the world's leading power, for any power. And so this is why I think you're seeing this examining around the world of not just semiconductors but other critical supply chains that maybe the Europeans or the Japanese or the Australians or our friends in Latin America aren't so interested in having to toe the Chinese Communist Party line on, say, Tibet or Taiwan, or name the sticky wicket issue, the genocide going on in Xinjiang, to maintain access to a mask or a semiconductor or a pharmaceutical component. So I think this issue comes to light with all of these developments. And semiconductor manufacturing is just like all other manufacturing, really, where you've seen this move globally, obviously in the last 30 or 40 years, from the West to the East. And semiconductors have not been spared from that move. In fact, in the US, only 12% of manufacturing is done here. And on the high-end chips, almost 70% of all semiconductor manufacturing is done just in Taiwan or in South Korea. So think of that sort of major geopolitical vulnerability that has been created just on that reliance. So again, we look to the world looks to these supply chains, and our adversaries look to these supply chains as well. So Congressman Nye mentioned China. China is certainly very interested in semiconductors. They have laid out their interest in typical sort of Communist Party fashion with a series of state mandates, including the China Made in 2025 plan, but scores of others where the state controlled apparatus that controls state output is looking to have China be a global leader in semiconductors here in the near term. In fact, some estimates show China could be the world's top semiconductor manufacturer as soon as 2030. So if we start to kind of plan against that, we want to see, and in the paper we try to take a look at the companies who are most advanced inside of China, what they're doing, how they're getting there, and then what the US or the West or this sort of what we call an emerging democratic technology alliance can do to sort of mitigate against that threat, frankly, in a very similar way to the Huawei effort globally, where really there's now this global consensus that Huawei and ZTE are a national security threat. And if we just allowed them to dominate the telecommunications infrastructure market, that would have tremendously adversarial consequences for our economic and national security interests. So who are these companies in China? What are they up to, and where are they going? The most important that we think of is a company called SMIC. This is SMIC is the acronym. This is the largest and the most important chip maker for sure. It has unquestioned ties to the Chinese military and intelligence services most directly. In fact, those ties landed it on the Commerce Department's entity list, which is essentially its trade blacklist right there at the close of the Trump administration, though the current administration, President Biden, have retained that entity listing, which is awfully important. They make the high-end sort of processing chips that national security folks worry most about. Then there's a company called HiSilicon. This is a direct subsidiary to Huawei. In fact, they provide most of Huawei's chips directly. They are also subject to the entity list when Huawei was added in their subsidiaries were added as well. So those two are at least currently covered. Then we look at a company called YMTC. This is a memory chip company, a NAND memory chip company that also has very close ties to the Chinese Communist Party. It not only has those ties to the CCP, it's also listed officially as a national champion. There's a Nikkei article, I think Dan is going to throw in the chat if you would be so kind, that really does a deep dive into YMTC to give folks a good glimpse into where they're going aggressively, particularly with SMIC's listing on the entity list, that they have sort of become the Chinese government's new chip champion, where all the resources, the typical captured market share, the state-backed R&D, the state-backed financing, the theft of intellectual property secrets overseas being handed to YMTC directly, where we see typically those activities. You're sure to find those happening at YMTC as well. And the Nikkei story actually broke down their supply chain, interestingly enough. They have a great reliance on US semiconductor manufacturing equipment, for example, which should give policymakers some concern. Then the next company we think about is called CXMT. This is another memory company, DRAM market leader, also has direct ties to the Chinese Communist Party. I think Dan might throw up a little short, brief video on their activities from the China Watch security folks who do good work, the China Tech Threat folks, I should say, which I commend viewers to take a look at. And in response to these companies' growth and their potential threat to, again, all these critical national and economic security supply chain issues, you have almost all industrialized countries looking to mitigate against that threat, to secure their own supply chain, either directly by building fabs. These are where the chips are actually manufactured themselves, or going in with allied partners, democratic countries in particular, to secure those supply chains. So in the U.S., for example, we lay out the policy responses, which include something called the CHIPS Act. The CHIPS Act was included as part of the NDAA a couple of years ago, and included around $20 billion in incentives domestically for U.S. manufacturing of semiconductor fabs here in the U.S. That for those Congress watchers, that's great to have an authorization, but as Michael knows better than anybody, an authorization is not a single real dollar. So now we need to make sure that program is fully funded. And then there's a lot going on commerce. Excuse me. So we mentioned BIS earlier. They are, or commerce more broadly, is looking at export controls, including of semiconductor manufacturing equipment, semiconductors potentially themselves, as an issue to worry about for security purposes, particularly on high-end chips or high-end SME. Potentially, there could be another advance notice of proposed rulemaking out of Commerce to wrap up their effort on foundational technologies that would touch on potentially these exports to the Chinese companies we mentioned: SMIC, YMTC, SMIC. I just mentioned that, and CXMT. If you can keep track of all these acronyms, you win a prize at the end, and Dan will be sending that directly to you. But I think it's very important to note, it's not just the U.S. who is mitigating against this threat. You're seeing this around the world, and sort of, if you look at it holistically, it really is this sort of ad hoc alliance of democratic nations that are also worried about China and their position in technology and the reliance on them potentially therein. So in South Korea, for example, this country has put $450 billion into semiconductor manufacturing, which is just an astounding number for a mid-sized country, mid-sized economy. Much more money than the United States is putting in, and obviously much lower GDP. But it gives you a sense for how important they view it. TSMC just can't build fast enough in Taiwan. This is where we've seen some of the log jam, though some of it is due to weather issues or just overwhelming demand for chips. TSMC is also looking to diversify. They're considering or have planned a plant actually in the United States, in Arizona, close by to a new potential Intel plant, or a cited Intel plant, I should say. So interesting that two major companies looking both to build in the U.S. and in Arizona. Japan has not put quite the resources in to their own semiconductor industry, but it's clearly a top priority, and the new leadership in Japan is signaling perhaps a little more meat on the bones for their efforts are in store. The Europeans have also, the European Union in particular, has put in resources to secure their own chip supply chain. They prior to the French getting mad at us for the Dan's going to pronounce the acronym for the AUKUS alliance on the sub deal. We were forging a plan with the EU to try to secure supply chains together. In fact, Intel also has announced $95 billion for 2 plants in Europe. So that's also exciting. We can flush out some of the recommendations, I think, more in Q&A, Dan, but I can go through them quickly just to give listeners here and readers of the report a quick overview as to what Michael and I are calling for. We're looking to, we're recommending that YMTC and CXMT are both added to the entity list along with SMIC. To us, it just makes perfect sense that those next two leading Chinese semiconductor manufacturing companies with direct ties to the CCP leadership in the same way that SMIC has would be added to that list. And then we're calling for a conclusion of those foundational technologies export controls at commerce, which is has to be done very delicately. We can understand why this is taking quite a bit of time. There are often unintended consequences with these types of actions, and we want to make sure we do this right and we don't undermine this extraordinary leadership position that the U.S. is in, where I mentioned earlier, we only manufacture 12% of the chips, but we have leading fabless foundries like Qualcomm and NVIDIA who make the best chips on planet Earth, and we want to make sure we protect that leading edge. That it's done carefully, while at the same time we're not handing this incredibly valuable technology to folks who could even put it on the battlefield against us in a place like Taiwan or other potential hotspots around the world. It's something certainly worth worrying about. We encourage this sort of multilateral democratic technology alliance. I think this is very exciting. Actually, I was super excited about this naming and shaming of Chinese cyber espionage in one of the Microsoft attacks, where you had NATO, the European Union, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand all team up and point the same finger at the Chinese military to say that it was them who conducted this hack, and it's completely unacceptable. It's the first time I had seen that alliance emerge, and I hope it's not the last going forward, Dan. And finally, I'll mention the Quad. So the Quad is essentially a good chunk of those countries plus India who have put out statements saying working on semiconductor supply chain security is in the national security interests of those four countries: India, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. And so with that, that's what we've recommended. It's about 20 pages. I did hand it to my 8-year-old, and I think she read the first sentence and handed it back to me and told me it was boring. So I hope everybody else has a better experience.
Thanks, Andy. And yes, the prize for all the acronyms will be an autographed copy of the report. That said, Michael, anything you want to add before we get to the discussion? Secrets to working with Andy that you want to share with the audience?
Well, first of all, Andy, truly a pleasure to work with you on this paper. So this has been a tremendous group and effort. Andy covered a good chunk of stuff. The one thing is, for those who aren't steeped in the kind of semiconductor manufacture, I think there's another important topic to discuss here, and that is it's not China's. It's just not controlling the access to semiconductors themselves. It's actually because they're manufacturing these semiconductors, even though they may be designed in the United States, they're built and manufactured there, and that allows the opportunity for changes to be made in the production process. Sometimes it's for cost savings, sometimes it's for nefarious reasons, but it doesn't change the fact that Trojans can be installed into the semiconductors during manufacture that can do everything from cause leaking information from the hardware to another actor. It can cause semiconductors to behave erratically, or it can actually kill. You can put kill switches in them to make them stop. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of thought to think about the consequences, especially in the national security front, when virtually every component that we manufacture now has semiconductors in it. So I think that you have a twofold problem here. One is just that they control the the access to the chips, but because they're so integral to the manufacture, is that we never know what we're getting. And even though those that design them may check the semiconductor and chip, they're looking largely at compliance, not things that are added into it or deleted or quality of product. So we don't have a way to really know what we're getting every time. What we do know that is that counterfeits are already in the supply system. It happens. We also know that sabotage chips are already in the supply system. We just don't truly know to what extent and the scope how vulnerable we are. But I think the important thing that we have to recognize is this is a vulnerability, and we now know it. So I always say you can't solve a problem you can't see. We're showing the problem. We recognize the problem. Now we have to figure out exactly what we're going to do with it. And I think those things that Andy outlined are some good steps, but there's a lot of discovery learning that's going to have to be done as we move forward.
Thanks, Michael. And I think your comment there on the trust and building secure supply chains is important. I also see a question here from the audience. One question here, and it gets at the next thread I want to pull at, though, is where one, with the shortage in the supply chain, you see the bifurcation of issues. The shortage in many ways is an issue with the commoditized chips that are made in China and other places. It's not so much the high tech ones. It's really the ones that go into mass components into cars, vehicles, things like that. That's a largely commoditized supply chain. There's not as much of a national security concern there in many ways. At the same time, you also want to protect, though, the intellectual issues and the intellectual property, the high tech equipment and tooling. So, how do you, in a way, address these two challenges, which are very different in their nature, but get lumped together? You know, when you have to talk to that policymaker in that elevator for 30 seconds, it's just all one semiconductor issue. How do we address those two separate tracks within the same challenge?
Yeah, no, it's a challenge, and I think that, I mean, we have two different things at play, especially when you're talking about legislation and policymakers. Is that, policy generally needs a forcing function to happen. Unfortunately, sometimes that's what it takes, and my sense is that while we can take baby steps, and baby steps will be taken, I think at times you need to have that aha moment where for people to realize, and I think those, as long as these discussions are only 30 seconds long in that elevator, it's near impossible to discuss how complex this issue is on the international front, on the production front, on the industrial front within the United States. There are so many things, and they truly are weaved together. But I think we need to have the discussions. Just you can't solve them in 30 seconds.
Yeah, and I might build off of that, Michael. So I think you're right, Dan, that you don't worry as much about the low-end chips from a national security perspective, other than you're still beholden to that critical product that you need for your economy to function. And if we allowed all of that manufacturing to go to a hostile place, I don't know, say in China, and they decided to turn that off, or say we're going to reduce your chip inputs by 25% unless you subscribe to One China and you disavow Taiwan. Whatever those threats are that we see the Chinese Communist Party using around the world today, the more reliant we are on them for the things that we need, particularly for our economy. And frankly, those cheap chips are also in everything the Pentagon uses, right? Then it's still not a place we want to be in. But you're right; it is a very complex issue, right? There's at least 4 broad categories of chips. There are an extraordinarily complicated set of uh, SME, the semiconductor manufacturing equipment that goes into building, into fabs and into the manufacturing and production. And we haven't scratched the surface of any of those just yet.
Uh, Another thread that's clear in some of the questions from the audience, and it's perhaps not a technical question, but just one of pure geostrategic, diplomatic, and military concern. How important is U.S. strategy towards Taiwan, building ties with Taiwan, and deterring conflict over Taiwan? How key is that to our semiconductor security?
I think it's key. I mean, if you look at the numbers and where they're manufactured, between China, their growing industry, 50% in Taiwan right now. It doesn't take a lot of math to figure out if there is a conflict between China and Taiwan, the implications to us and our allies, and including during our potential involvement in such a conflict.
Mhm. And how, what would be your thoughts and recommendations on deterring that? Should we be building stronger alliances, trade ties and agreements on this? How, I think the audience is interested in your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer in increased ties, more discussion, more dialogue, but coming up with a comprehensive strategy over time that is going to reduce our reliance and our vulnerability to a conflict in that area. Andy, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's twofold, right? You have the direct Taiwan bilateral relationship, but I think as importantly, you have is this effort to diversify that reliance in that supply chain, right? So if even if TSMC manufactures overseas, that begins to help, because now obviously China's not going to if they went across the Taiwan Strait, they're not going to capture the plant in Arizona or the potentially one in Japan, as is being discussed. So I think it's twofold. I mean, separately from semiconductors, I'm certainly a strong believer. I suspect Michael is too, in standing up for a democratic ally in Taiwan that we can rely on. Sometimes I wish that I think we all wish they would do a little more to defend themselves. I like former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien's analogy of, let's help Taiwan turn itself into a porcupine. So if the Chinese come to grab it, it's going to hurt. It's going to leave a mark. And what are areas we can help them do that to help deter that potential action? And then, as I mentioned, I think as importantly, take care of ourselves, bring some of this production back to the U.S., encourage allies to do the same. I mean, I think we should be just as happy as with, or close to just as happy with an Intel plant going into the UK as we are into Arizona, right? It's the same geopolitical output. It's not the same economic output, of course, that policymakers will look for but from the national security perspective, it's the same outcome.
For policymakers, kind of a quick sense of what would be the key U.S. strengths in either IP or manufacturing that we should be protecting? What are the most important aspects of U.S. advantages that we should prioritize?
Well, that starts to get pretty technical. It's the thickness of the wafers and the technology that we do lead on. I saw someone in the chat mentioned that the U.S. And frankly the South Koreans and the Taiwanese are ahead of the Chinese technologically, which is true and very important to protect. The problem is that gap is closing, and if you it's just like we used to look at. I was on the House Intelligence Committee. I joined shortly after it issued its report on Huawei and the national security threat therein. And when we looked at Huawei's growth it was going like this year over year. And the others, the Western vendors, were going like this. And they were just going to swallow up their competitors, which is part of Chinese Communist Party strategy in many key industries, including technology, particularly technology. And so if we just sit back and let it happen, they're going to do what they do in almost every other industry they care about. They're going to conduct international espionage to steal trade secrets and hand it to their national champions. They're going to invest in humans. They have more engineers in engineering school than we have engineers. They're going to put massive state subsidies for research and development, for essentially unlimited state financing. They also do something that doesn't get talked about as much. It's the second biggest economy in the world, and they will capture a market share for one of their national champions. So say, Huawei, no matter what you do, you're going to have 64% of the Chinese telecommunications market. So start there. And it's the second biggest economy on the planet. And so we don't have any of that, right? And so it's trying to, we don't have to match them dollar for dollar. We don't have to out China, but we do have to be in the game. And I think things like the CHIPS Act help us get in that game, where exactly like the questioner in the chat is alluding to, it gives our innovation and our which is our advantage, a fighting chance. And that's I think the best that we can do. And I'm confident in U.S. innovation. If the playing field doesn't need to be level, we just need to have a fighting chance, I think.
I think he's spot on. I keep this quote on my desk from Claude Shannon, who's kind of the father of information theory. And basically what it says, one ought to design systems under the assumption that the enemy will immediately gain full familiarity with them. So especially when they're heavily resourced, right? When they will spend everything they can and they need to get access to secrets, they will take advantage of that and do it. And you have to build that in how we think about the problem set from the beginning. If we want to secure our supply chain, we need to make sure that we understand not just where it is today, but where we think the enemy is going to go and where they're going to be in time. And we have to react accordingly. If we fail to do that, we will be litigating this, for years to come with an unsatisfying result.
In terms of the resources, you actually mentioned too the personnel side of it. How do we also look at investing in the workforce, education, attracting visa talent, foreign talent via visas? How do we look at the human element side of this?
Yeah, I mean, talk about something that's complex here, right? Because of, we have, if you want to dive into, and I'm going to get into a massive discussion about the U.S. education system. But I mean, the H-1B visa program exists for a reason. It's because we have a shortfall in talent to work on these high-end problem sets. And so the reality is that in the interim, we're going to have to continue to rely on visa programs to get these skill sets and the talent we need. But at the same time, I would personally love to sit down and have meaningful discussions about where education is in this country and what it needs to be. A dear friend of mine, Bill McRaven, once asked former U.S. SOCOM commander what he saw as the greatest threat to national security. He said it was the U.S. education system. And I don't think he's far off. Andy, thoughts?
Always make your bed. My wife lives by, she loves that one. 100,000% agree. I mean, if you talk to almost any company who's innovating, that's the first thing that comes out of their mouth is access to STEM workers. So, I think the center has done some good work on this as well, and commend folks to take a look at that. But it's a huge challenge that has to be solved if we're gonna compete for sure. Of course, we don't tell 1 million kids they're going to go into STEM like the Chinese can. But man, we got to get kids more interested. We have to have a better pipeline to STEM for sure. I'm going to do everything as I can with my two daughters to, make them learn the math and science I never learned. But because I think that's, no question where the future is, and my goodness, we have to get it right.
So beyond the people, looking at the policy toolbox we have here, a lot of questions we have talk about export controls, and how do we carefully find that balance? Because an example is made of how ITAR, when it comes to aerospace, means now that just many space flight components are just made overseas. How do you craft them in a way? I acknowledge part of that would be working with allies to coordinate that, but also, how do you use export controls in a way that we don't cut off or disenfranchise or put American companies behind the eight ball because of the rules we've put down? Andy?
Yeah, it's essential to get it right for sure, and it is delicate. And if you put a hammer down on one end, something may pop up on an end you didn't anticipate. So you want to make sure you get it right. I do think it can be done right. I think we write in the paper about uh, potentially some interest in a multilateral export control regime that would, could have a greater impact. Takes a little longer to implement. But I'm also not a believer that there's no way we can shut off access to the most critical technologies to our most serious geopolitical adversary on the planet. We have to be able to do both. And I definitely believe in American innovation, protecting that. It's gotten us to the leadership position globally that we are economically and militarily. But for 40 years, we have been handing our primary geopolitical adversary they haven't been for 40 years, but to the Chinese directly, and we see them taking that innovation and technology and using it against us where we are most vulnerable, whether that's in cyber or in space, or Michael's much greater expert than I am on this, but in our anti-carrier activities you see out of the Chinese, it's very, very concerning. And I think a lot of national security watchers believe it's almost more important that we get that right than having the greatest next, fighter or bomber that frankly the Chinese just copy anyway. We've seen with the F-35. So,
Michael, anything to add to that? Okay.
Actually, I don't. He
Yeah.
pretty much nailed it.
Yeah, nailed it. There you go. A plus. But looking also at the toolbox, there were proposals we've heard, and not necessarily with semiconductors. It came up with telecoms. Should the U.S. government be investing directly in companies? There was talk of, potentially creating a national champion using Nokia and Ericsson as well. One of the questions says we seem to be only looking at tools like export controls when China's actually steering companies to make acquisitions. We also acknowledge you don't want to out China, but do we need to be a little more muscular in that effect? Think differently there.
Yeah, my sense is we should consider all options. I mean, we have to be realistic on who we are as a culture and as a citizenry. We're not big fans of nationalizing anything. We don't nationalize energy. We're not going to probably nationalize semiconductors. But I think we need to get creative on how we think about the problems that are out there. Because I'll tell you, the way we do things now isn't getting us where we need to be to protect ourselves, not only today, but into the future. Because this is only going to get more complex. So I think we need to think about how we think, and do some real hard analysis on where we want to be when this is all done.
yeah, I kind of think I worry a little bit about the government getting involved, just because I think the government will probably screw it up. Where I would much rather, if we can protect the pathway for companies to innovate, we'll continue to lead the world in innovation. If we upend that model, I worry that we'll fall into the into sort of China's trap.
In looking at the supply chains, it's an interesting question here. We talk so often, and yes, there's our key democratic allies will be important. What do we see as the role of how can we build partnerships with the developing world on semiconductor supply chains? You know, beyond the concerns, of course, of how rare earths and other commodities fit into the supply chain there, but the global south, that the technology competition will be over the customers and supply chains there. So how should we be looking at those regions?
Yeah, my sense is with the developing nations, what you risk is you going in and working with nations and try to build an infrastructure that has a um, much more limited workforce to actually to work. They don't have the STEM folks either, but and we're doing significantly better than they are. So I fear that we could solve one problem and create 10 more. I mean, you got to find the right balance. I mean,
Mhm.
what we try to do as in government generally is we look for the simplest answer to very complex problems, and it's always just there's a layered approach. We're going to have to take multiple things and put them on top of each other to layer our response as a nation on how we protect ourselves, because this is complex and there is no simple answer. Um, and so I'm all about looking at those layered approaches to get things done.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think you'd look more to countries like India or Vietnam to move some of these uh, supply chains. That would be more realistic, where they already have you know, this intellectual base, where they have manufacturing, than just kind of, you know, creating something out of nothing and hoping for the best. I don't see that as a good outcome. But particularly India, I think could be a very interesting relationship. Uh, you know, given they share a huge border, of course, with China. They're very worried about China's role in Asia, increasingly looking to partner with like-minded countries to mitigate against what they see as a growing threat on their border. And I think we should be doing everything we can to, you know, secure that key ally.
Michael, I want to follow up on your earlier comments where you brought up Trojans and sabotage in the supply chain. What do you think the network, or would we be building a ecosystem of trusted foundries? Would there be other countries that could be part of this? What would be the chip supply chain that you could sleep easily at night, knowing that at least you know, maybe specifically for defense, but what would a trusted supply chain look like?
Yeah, I think that if you had vetted manufacturers who and with that had effective spot checks. I mean, we're on the cusp of having the ability to do uh, diagnostics on semiconductors, so we can look at complex systems by a widget that you can add into any system and do a diagnostic to see if there are any Trojans. So, I mean, that addresses some of your issues in the past. Is things that are currently on our shelves and we're currently using. Is doing a spot check model to find out the scope and scale of those Trojans that have been either nefariously or by economics inserted into the manufacturing. But going forward, I think you achieve that um, by secure foundries, so we can witness and control manufacturing.
Would you then suggest a prioritization? What are the sectors, I guess, that use semiconductors that you're most concerned about? You know, Andy mentioned automotives, just, you know, that's an important visible supply chain. But what are the ones, if you had to rank your concerns?
Yeah, I would say it's U.S. infrastructure as far as electrical grids, fuel distribution. Those are things that don't generally people think of as high-end national security issues. Those are commercial, off-the-shelf, truly, get it from wherever you can and install it. Frequently, that's the case. So, it's I think that is right up there with those things that are I call life and limb systems, which are military aircraft, our ships, our submarines, those things where U.S. lives are at stake. Um, I mean, we're putting our sons and daughters at risk every day because of the high-end equipment that they're using and that are in the military and in the intelligence community, and with not a lot of assurance on the integrity of the system from design.
And in terms of how a policymaker might prioritize this, is there a limitation to what can be done in Washington, and what conversations need to be had in corporate boardrooms about trade-offs between cost and security of supply chains? What if you were being asked, changing hat from speaking to the congressional audience now to the corporate boardroom, what advice would you be giving in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, I would be. Sometimes you need a forcing function to get things done. So, what I would love to see is legislation that would drive our national security sector to build in, to drive all new acquisitions, to have some sort of monitoring device or monitoring capability to make sure that there are no Trojans inserted. And, and there's going to be an initial cost to that. There's no doubt. But I will tell you, it's our national security is worth it. And when it's all said and done, we'll end up with better, safer products for our warfighters and the American people. I mean, something the industry's not going to do it themselves. Um, they're not incentivized to do that. Andy, do you have anything thoughts?
No, I think that's right. Other than potentially, I think you run into the same issue that we saw for, frankly, decades in cyber, where, before there were even CISOs, they were, the nerds in the basement that no one talked to, until all of a sudden they're starting to wipe out actual market cap of their company. Suddenly now the CISOs are in the C-suite, and they have a fiduciary responsibility to protect their own networks and their IP. And if, clearly since COVID, supply chain just broadly has become a C-suite issue. A couple more disruptions, and I think you could see something like Semiconductors Rising to that type of level, where the folks at the top want to ensure they have access to all their critical components, and semiconductors happen to be one of those.
Well, I don't see too many further questions from the audience, so I'd like to turn it back over to you all for some closing comments, things you want us to be thinking about as we talk to others, share the message, and certainly hope read our report and distribute it. But any closing thoughts for us?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Dan. I'll kick it to Michael for his thoughts. It's a little cliche. You hear everything is sort of the new oil, right? Data is the new oil. But it has been said that semiconductors are the new oil. And I think it's important to think of it in that construct, as in it's something the global economy relies on, and the national security and intelligence apparatuses around the world rely on. And frankly, they're willing to secure those. They potentially could be willing to go to have some type of conflict if they're not secured or made unsecure, in the same way that oil raised the level to that sort of national interest at such a high level. So I think that's why you see the interest on today's call. I think that's why the center has done such great work on these topics, because of that level of interest. And we did our last report 1 year ago to the month, and just the landscape is sort of night and day change. So maybe 12 months from now, we'll all reconvene and have a new set of issues to discuss it. I don't think it's going anywhere.
And just in closing, just to reiterate a thing I mentioned earlier, is that industry isn't going to solve this on their own. They're not incentivized to do it. And I hope that by reports like this and venues like this and opportunities like this, that it highlights the the risk we are at as a nation, because the last thing I would like to see happen is to get action only as a result of what I'll call a semiconductor 9/11, or some event that could happen it takes something horrific to get the aha moment for our nation on this. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Andy and Michael. Congressman.
I want to, yeah, I want to add a thanks to Dan for managing what was a really interesting conversation. Andy and Michael, appreciate the work on this. As Michael suggested, you need to identify this problem before you can elevate it and then have it solved. You all have both identified in detailed ways the nature of the problem and also proposed some solutions. The conversation was wide-ranging and very important. I think you raised some really vital points about where we need to go from here, and I was compelled by the sense of there being some more immediate term things we can do policy-wise, investments, and removal of barriers to innovation that will help our country compete and move ahead in this arena. Some long-term questions: education. Are we preparing our workforce? Are we even preparing our young people to understand the nature of the challenges in a rapidly advancing technological world and what it means to plug apps into their cell phone? Do we have just a basic sense of awareness in the country that would lead us to be able to have really fruitful policy conversations about the challenges and some of the hard trade-offs? On the positive side, we continue to be a tremendously innovative country and marketplace, and that's great. We continue to be a leader and leverage very good relationships with a lot of countries, but we have a lot of work to do. There are upcoming fora for a conversation, including a summit of democracies coming up in December, which we very much hope will include on its agenda some of these questions, if not solving of them in the great detail, at least surfacing them as areas where we are aligned and share challenges. Andy mentioned groups like the Quad that have established a working group on emerging technologies, the US, EU, and other countries joining together on cybersecurity and other issues recently. There's a lot of positive momentum that just kind of needs to be gelled a little more, I think. And we hope that our work will continue to raise the important questions, put proposed solutions on the table, and really keep this topic on the front burner. One of the challenges that we find, of course, in American politics is that it's easy for important things to slip to the back and for us to be absorbed in the day-to-day of dramatic personalities and other politics in the United States. But your work is helping keep these issues on the forefront. So I just want to thank you, Andy and Michael, for taking this on, Dan for leading the talk today, and to our audience for joining us and really participating with a lot of great questions, ideas, and comments for us. We look forward to your inputs as we continue our work on this, and are very thankful for you spending the time with us today to delve deeply into some of these issues. So we look forward to seeing you all as the conversation continues soon. Thanks very much. Take care. Bye.